It was mid-afternoon, and she had been on the road for quite a while. She was getting hungry and was in need of a break, so she decided that it was time to find a place to stop so she could rest for a bit and get a bite to eat. For a while, it seemed like there was nowhere to stop, but then she spotted what appeared to be a pizzeria. It seemed like a decent enough place, so she decided to make the stop. After shutting her car off, she got out and stretched her legs a bit before heading inside. As she entered the establishment, she was hit with the aroma of freshly prepared pizza. She headed to the counter to place an order, and it was at that moment that she saw him. At first, she didn't pay much attention to him, as she caught a glimpse of him from the corner of her eye, while she got in line and waited patiently for her turn to order something to eat. As she stood there, she felt the piercing of his gaze as he stood there quietly. She became uneasy as she glanced at him, as he stood there, watching her closely. He was a tall, slender man who was dressed in a uniform. The man stood there like a statue as he continued to watch her every move. She looked away from him for a moment as tension rose from within. She tried to remain calm as she stood there and waited patiently. Then, she looked at him again, and their eyes met. His eyes were as the sky on a stormy day. He had a stern expression on his face that sent shivers down her spine as he stared into her eyes. The way he looked at her made her uncomfortable, and it was like nothing she had ever experienced. It was as though his gaze was piercing right through her, like he was looking deep into her soul. She started to tremble, even as she looked away from him. She wanted him to go away, but he wouldn't. She no longer had an appetite, and at that point she just wanted to leave. She was about to walk away when the cashier spoke to her. "Miss, are you all right?" the cashier asked. "I'm fine," she said. "What would you like today?" the cashier asked. "You know what? I just remembered that I needed to be somewhere, and I'm running late," she said. With that, she left the pizzeria and headed straight to her car. When she approached her car, she got into it and locked the doors. It was then that she noticed the man was standing outside with his eyes fixed on her. She took her car key and tried to put it into the ignition. For a moment it was a struggle as her hand shook, but then she managed to get the key into the ignition. She started her car, and she never looked back as she drove away from the pizzeria. After leaving the pizzeria, she continued on her journey. Her heart pounded in her chest rapidly as she gripped the steering wheel tightly. She was never more relieved to be away from the horrible man and the premises where she had seen him. She was uncertain whether she would ever be able to forget the man's intense gaze. It was as cold as ice on a winter's day, and even as she drove further away, it sent chills running down her spine. Unfortunately, distance did not give her a sense of comfort. She was still shaken up by the horrible experience, and all she could think about was the man with the unblinking starry that seemed to pierce through her. She couldn't shake off the sensation it had left, making her feel as though he could see right through her. Even at that moment, it left an eerie feeling, one that sent shivers all through her. She speedily carried on with her expedition, with the only thing on her mind was the terrifying stranger whom she wanted to get as far away from as possible. The horrible encounter left an enduring scar and a lingering sense of unease that continued to haunt her. As she glanced in the rearview mirror, a feeling of apprehension engulfed her. What was once a journey of freedom, discovery, and excitement has now become an isolated sweep of uncertainty and an ominous sense of dread that overwhelmed her. She feared that the remainder of the road trip would be tainted with an unshakable sense of foreboding. She was reluctant to make any more stops due to the fear of everything being suspicious, every place and stranger potentially unnerving. There was also the fear of not being far enough away from him. She was terrified of the possibility of him finding her, no matter how far she would go. As she drove on, she was plagued with the shadow that followed her, the distress of being found by what had become her worst nightmare. Several hours had passed since she left the pizzeria. It was the evening and the sun was starting to set, but she wanted to continue on her journey. By that time, she was miles away from the establishment, where she encountered the horrible man with the penetrating gaze. She sighed with relief as she thought about the distance between them, and she hoped that safety would be within reach and she would be able to put the horrible ordeal behind her. As time went on, she started to grow weary, but she didn't want to stop, not after what had happened before. She was determined to keep moving, but with the passing of time, it became more of a challenge for her. The road trip was becoming exhausting, and she also realized that her car was running low on fuel. As much as she hated to, she knew that she would have to make a stop. For miles, there was no sign of a filling station in sight, and it left her feeling trepidatious. The last thing she wanted was to run out of fuel and be stranded along the road, vulnerable and out in the open where predators could spot her. She continued to travel on as she dealt with the inner conflict of not wanting to stop and the fear of being stranded along the road. Eventually, she came to a small town where there was a filling station. For a moment, she was reluctant to stop, but she knew that she had to since her car was nearly out of fuel. She went to the filling station and pulled in where the pump was. She nervously glanced around before she got out of the car. At that moment, paranoia began to set in as she looked around at the surrounding area. She wanted to refuel her car as quickly as possible so she could be on her way. Then, something caught her attention from the corner of her eye. She was overtaken by the sensation of needles and pins because she feared that her worst nightmare was there and had found her. She wanted to leave, but she knew that she couldn't, at least not until after she refueled her car. She glanced in the direction where the stalker had caught her attention, but he wasn't there. She looked around for a moment and then she sighed with relief whenever she realized that he wasn't around. As she was about to refuel her car, someone else's hand touched hers. She gasped, and then she looked at the stranger who stood before her as he grabbed the nozzle of the gas pump and started to refuel her car. As their eyes met, shivers were sent down her spine. She recognized his eyes and face. He seemed so familiar, yet at the same time, he wasn't the same. She took a step back as they kept their eyes on one another. He looked nearly identical to the man from the pizzeria, except he was younger. Her heart raced and pounded in her chest as she took another step back. As the young man looked at her, he suddenly seemed confused, and he wondered why she reacted as she did toward him when he just wanted to help. She wanted to run, but she knew that she couldn't. After her car was refueled, she walked away hurriedly. Meanwhile, the young man just stood there and watched her curiously. She went inside to pay for the fuel that was put into her car. As she was about to pay for the fuel, her heart sank, and she panicked as she looked at the cashier, who looked just like her worst nightmare. Then she looked away for a moment because she couldn't bear to see his face. When she looked at him again, she was perplexed whenever she realized that there was no resemblance between the cashier and the man from the pizzeria. "Are you all right?" the cashier asked. Suddenly, she realized that the young man who she encountered at the pump had come inside and was standing next to her. with an expression of concern on his face as he looked at her. "Miss, are you all right?" the cashier asked. She glanced at the young man again before she responded. "I'm fine. It's been a long day, and I just need to keep moving," she said. She paid for the fuel, and then she left the filling station. She was glad to be out of there and on the road again. After refueling her car, she continued her journey regardless of how late it was. She was determined to keep moving, even though she continued to grow more and more weary. She didn't want to make any more stops unless it was absolutely necessary, since the last 2 times when she had stopped were unpleasant experiences. With time, she found it more and more difficult to stay awake. Her energy was waning as time passed. She tried putting down a window so that the cool air would hit her and keep her awake. For a moment it worked, but not for long. As she continued to travel, she grew even more tired, and it became an even bigger struggle to stay awake. Even with the window open, she found herself dozing off for a brief moment. Then, she nearly ran off the road, and it was at that moment that she realized that she had no choice but to make another stop. She hoped that she would be able to find a place to stay, but unfortunately, there was nothing in sight. The last thing she wanted to do was pull over and sleep in her car, leaving her jeopardized with the possibility of an unwanted encounter. She was relieved to see a town just ahead. As much as she dreaded the idea of making another stop, at the same time, she was also relieved that she finally found a place where she could find rest. She located an inn where she decided to spend the night. After parking the car, she went inside, made the necessary arrangements, and obtained the key to the room where she was to stay for the night. She glanced around as she walked to the room where she planned to stay. After she unlocked the door, she went inside straight away and locked the door behind her. She sighed with relief because she managed to find a place where she felt she would be safe for the night. Without hesitation, she made her way to one of the bedrooms. When she approached the bedroom, she sat down. She sighed before she laid down on the bed. As she became relaxed, she thought about the young man who she saw at the filling station. As she thought about him, she started to feel bad about how she acted toward him. He was only trying to help her, and she didn't even thank him. She regretted her behavior toward him, but unfortunately, there was nothing that she could do about it at that point, since she was miles away from him. She was about to fall asleep when she heard a sound that came from one of the other rooms. She didn't feel like getting up to investigate the cause of the sound because she was so tired. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep when she'd heard yet another sound. She still didn't want to get up from the bed. She was becoming frustrated because the entire reason she had made the stop in the first place was so she could get some rest. She sighed, and then she closed her eyes once again. For a moment, everything was quiet, but then there was another sound which seemed closer and somewhat louder than the previous ones. She opened her eyes and glanced around, but saw nothing. Then she looked at the closet door and noticed that it appeared to be opened slightly. She became fearful because she knew that it had been closed before. She blinked, and then she noticed that the closet door was closed. At that moment, she wondered if her mind was simply playing tricks on her. Everything became calm and quiet as she tried to rest. Something about the sudden complete silence left an unsettling feeling, and she opened her eyes and glanced at the closet door, which was closed. Then she looked around the room when she caught a glimpse of something in one of the corners of the room. She couldn't make out what it was, or whether it was an illusion. She was determined to get some rest, so she closed her eyes as she tried to remain calm. The unnerving feeling lingered, so she opened her eyes and glanced at the suspicious corner of the room. There was nothing there, so she sighed with relief before she turned onto her other side. At that moment, she became horrified as she was met with a terrifying sight. It was then that she realized that she was not alone. She hoped that it was all just a mirage or nothing more than a bad dream. But unfortunately, it wasn't. Once again, she was face to face with her worst nightmare, and she trembled as she kept her eyes on the face that was looking back at her, the one that continually haunted her. His cold stare left her stricken with chills that ran all through her. Her heart raced, and her stomach turned as she looked at him fearfully. She was so overcome with fear that she could barely move. He was about to take hold of her, but then she managed to get off the bed. She glanced at the phone that was on the nightstand, and then she looked at the man, who continued to look at her angrily. She grabbed the phone, hoping that she could call for help. When she realized that there was no dial tone and the line was dead, she dropped the phone as she kept her eyes on the man who started to move toward her. She took several steps back before she fled. She went outside and ran to her car. She was thankful that she still had her keys in her pocket. She tried to start her car, but for some reason it wouldn't start. Then she spotted the terrifying man outside with a knife in his hand as he looked at her viciously. She quickly got out of her car and took off, hoping to get away from him. Just then, a car stopped, and the driver of the mysterious car put the window down. "Miss, are you all right?" the driver asked. "No, I'm not," she said. "Do you need a ride?" the driver asked. She was reluctant to get into the car because the mysterious driver seemed suspicious to her due to his face being completely hidden. Then she turned and glanced at the man who was coming toward her. "Please, help me," she said. "Get in," the driver said. She decided to get into the car, and then she and the mysterious driver left. "Where are you going?" the driver asked. She was perplexed as she listened to the sound of the stranger's voice. "Your voice, you sound so young. Who are you?" she said. "I'm sorry, but I cannot tell you that. I must keep my identity hidden. All I can tell you is that I'm here to help you," the driver said. She wanted to know the identity of the stranger and why he wanted to help. "You haven't told me where you wanted me to take you," he said. "I just want to go home, but I'm a long way from where I live. For now, I just want to get as far away from this area as possible," she said. "Very well," the driver said. "What about my car?" she asked. "Don't worry about it. I'll figure it out. I promise," the driver said. They continued to move on, traveling further and further away from the place where her worst nightmare had found her. As she sat there quietly, she wondered how and why he found her. She was miles away from the pizzeria where she had first seen him, yet somehow he managed to locate her. The very thought left her petrified. She wondered if the nightmare would ever end, if she would ever be free from him, or if she would be forever trapped by him and the horrible terror that she was living. The mysterious rescuer continued his journey as he took her further and further away from the inn where the horrible man found her. She wasn't sure what to think or how to feel about the stranger who was in the car with her. She was thankful that she was able to escape her worst nightmare, but at the same time, she was uncertain about whether she should trust the young man who kept his identity hidden. There was so much that she wondered about, questions that she wanted answers to. Who was he? Where did he come from? What were his motives for wanting to help her? And why was he so adamant about keeping his identity hidden? The more she thought about it, the more she wondered whether it was safe to trust him. As they traveled on, she grew tired, but she was determined to stay awake. She was afraid to go to sleep, since she wasn't sure whether she could trust the mysterious stranger. He drove on until the sunrise, and then he decided to stop. "Why are we stopping now?" she asked. "Because we need to rest," the stranger said. "But what if he finds us?" she asked. "He won't if we play it safe and keep ourselves hidden," the stranger said. He drove to the back of the building, and then he parked the car. "Why are you parking here?" she asked. "To keep the car hidden," the stranger said. "How do I know this isn't a setup? How can I be sure that you're not in cahoots with him?" she asked. "I already told you that I'm here to help you. If you would just stop and think for a moment, you would realize that the questions you're asking don't even make sense. If I was in cahoots with who or whatever it is that you're running from, why would I have taken you away? Wouldn't it make more sense for me to apprehend you and take you back to the one you're running from?" the stranger said. "It could be a trick," she said. "Look, I took you away from your pursuer. I don't know how else to convince you that I'm here to help you and I have nothing to do with whatever it is that's happening. I suggest that you trust me if you truly want a way out of this," the stranger said. "Why must you keep your face hidden?" she asked. "Because it's what's best for both of us. Now, I suggest we get a room and get inside instead of being out in the open. The more time we waste out here, the more likely we'll be spotted, and then we'll both be in danger," the stranger said. He then got out of the car. She sighed, and then she reluctantly got out of the car afterward. After making the necessary arrangements, the two of them went into the room where they were to stay. "I suggest you try to get some rest. When we wake up, we'll continue our journey. I plan to get you home. As for your car, don't worry about it. As I told you before, I will take care of it. I promise. You just have to trust me," the stranger said. He turned and walked away from her, and he headed to one of the bedrooms. Then she sighed before she went into the other bedroom. She was still uncertain about whether trusting the stranger was a good idea. She hoped that he was being honest about his intention to get her home. She was unable to rest as her curiosity about the mysterious stranger continued to grow. She quietly got off the bed, left the room, and then she snuck into the room where he was. There, she spotted him on the bed asleep. She quietly moved toward the bed where he laid. When she approached the bed, her heart sank, and she started to tremble as she studied the stranger's face. There before her was the young man whom she had seen at the filling station, the one who looked like a younger version of her worst nightmare. She was overtaken with fear as she kept her eyes on him. Then, she took a step back before she turned and rushed out of the room, and she headed to the door. As she was about to leave, she became startled by the sound of his voice. "What are you doing?" he asked. She didn't respond. "I wouldn't do that," the young man said. "Why? What do you want from me?" she asked. "I keep telling you that I'm trying to help you, but you won't listen to me," the young man said. "I don't believe you," she said. "Why not?" the young man asked. "Why do you want to help me so badly?" she asked. "I have my reasons," the young man said. "How do I know you're not lying to me? How can I be sure that you're not leading him to me?" she asked. "I thought I was clear about what my intentions were," the young man said. "Who are you?" she asked. "Why can't you just let it go?" the young man asked. "Why can't you tell me who you are?" she asked. "I just can't. Why is it so important to you?" the young man said. "Because you look just like him," she said. "Who?" the young man asked. "The man who's been pursuing me, the one with the terrifying eyes who looks just like you," she said. The young man frowned. "Look, I swear that whatever it is that happened, I had nothing to do with it," he said. Oh no? Then how is it that you managed to find me when the last place I saw you was the filling station? She asked. The young man sighed before he responded. It's because I followed you, he said. You followed me? She said. Yes, the young man said. Why? She asked. It was because of the way you reacted toward me while at the filling station. I figured that something was up, and it caused me to become concerned. I wanted to know the reason you reacted to me as you did. That's why I followed you, he said. Do you expect me to believe that? Anyway, I don't like the idea of you following me, she said. I really do want to help you. You need to trust me. The young man said, Why should I trust you? I know that somehow you're connected to him. I can tell by your appearance. You look just like him, she said. He didn't respond, and she could tell by the look on his face and his awkward silence that he was reluctant to say anything. Have you nothing to say? She asked. The young man didn't respond. Who are you? She asked. The young man sighed before he reluctantly gave her his response. This is part of the reason I wanted to conceal my identity. It was because of how you reacted toward me at the filling station. I had my suspicions that something happened, although I was hoping that it wasn't the case, he said. What are you talking about? She asked. If your pursuer is who I think it is, then yes, I am connected to him. He is my father. The young man said. I knew it. I really can't trust you, she said. But you don't understand, the young man said. No, you don't understand. He won't leave me alone. I get the feeling that he wants to kill me. Then you come along, claiming that you want to help me, she said. She was about to leave when the young man rushed to the door and prevented her from going outside. Please, don't go out there. He may be out there, even as we speak. If you go out there, and he's nearby, he may spot you, and then we may both be in danger, he said. What am I supposed to do? You just told me that you're that lunatic's son, yet you're expecting me to trust you, she said. I understand why this may look suspicious, but you need to understand something. By acting hastily and running out there, you could be putting us both in danger, and that's the truth. I've been away for a while. During the time that I was away, I overheard things about him, terrible things. As his son, I don't want to believe that those things are true, but anymore, I can't be sure of anything. The truth is, he terrifies me, and at this time, he doesn't know where I am. If what I've been hearing about him is true, then I must protect you. Also, I have to know if what I've been hearing is in fact true. But at the same time, I can't let him know that I am close by. I must hide in the shadows and hope that he never finds me, the young man said. Why? She asked. I can't tell you everything, but if what I've been hearing about him is true, then I must stop him. I must somehow find a way to undo the things that he might have done, the young man said. And you're expecting me to believe this? She said. I'm not expecting you to do anything. It's up to you whether you choose to believe me. I'm just here to keep you safe, the young man said. Why? What has he done? She asked. I can't tell you that. Just please, try to get some rest and leave everything to me, the young man said. She could see that the young man was not about to let her go outside. She reluctantly went back to the room where she was trying to rest. She wasn't about to trust him because he seemed even more suspicious than before. Instead, she waited until everything was quiet. She wanted to make sure he went back to the room where he was sleeping, and then she planned to escape. After waiting for a moment, she opened the window and then she snuck out. After that, she fled, and she didn't dare look back as she escaped the son of her worst nightmare. After escaping the place where the man's son had taken her, she rushed to the nearest place that had a phone. She hoped that she would not be spotted by the man or his son. She decided to call her brother to see if he could give her a ride home. She hoped that he would be available to help her, especially since she was still miles away from home. At first, there was no response, and she worried about the possibility of the creepy man or his son showing up and capturing her. Then, finally, her brother answered the phone, and she explained the situation to him and asked him if he would be able to come and get her. She sighed with relief whenever he told her that he would be able to help her. She told him her location, and then he told her that he would be on his way. After that, she got off the phone. Just then, a car drove past slowly. She was overtaken with needles and pins as she watched nervously from the phone booth. When the car was no longer in sight, she left the phone booth and searched for a place to hide. She rushed behind a nearby building so she could keep out of sight. What she failed to notice was that the suspicious car was parked close by and the driver was watching and waiting patiently. He was like a predator on the prowl, stalking his prey, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. She continued to search for a place where she could remain out of sight. She was completely unaware of what was happening from behind. The suspicious stalker decided to make his move, and he slowly crept up on her. Then she turned and found herself faced with an alarming sight. There before her was her worst nightmare, who looked at her with an expression which left her overtaken with shivers. She turned and ran, and he chased her. She hoped that she would be able to escape him, but he continued to move quickly toward her, and then he took hold of her. She tried to break free from him, but it was no use. Then the man took her to his car and put her into it. After that, he approached the driver's side and got into his car, and then he drove away. She woke up and found herself in an unfamiliar place. She became uneasy because she didn't know where she was, nor did she recall how she got there. She glanced around, hoping to find a way out. As she tried to stand up, she realized that her hands and feet were bound with ropes. Then suddenly, the door to the room opened and someone stepped into the room. She became horrified when she realized who it was that was in the room with her. At that moment, she remembered being chased by her worst nightmare. After entering the room, he closed the door behind him and then he stood there for a moment as he looked at her angrily. He kept his eyes on her as he started to move toward her. She started to tremble whenever she noticed the knife that was in his hand. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked. He didn't respond. "What do you want from me?" she asked. He didn't respond. "I never did anything to you. Please, just stay away from me. Leave me alone," she said. The man did not listen to her as he continued to move toward her. When he approached her, he got down on his knees in front of her. He was so close to her that his face was just inches away from hers. She turned her face, even as she trembled. She couldn't stand to see his face. Just then, there was the loud sound of an alarm. The man became irritated and he glanced in the direction where the sound was coming from before he looked at her again and spoke. "Don't move," he said. He then stood up and left the room. While he was gone, she tried to get loose from the ropes that bound her hands and feet. Then someone else came into the room. It was the young man, and he had a knife in his hand. She tried to scoot away from him as he moved toward her. "Please, try to stay calm. I'm here to help you," the young man said. When he approached her, he cut the ropes from her wrists and ankles. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Why did you leave? I told you I was trying to help you." the young man said. Then he glanced at the doorway before he looked at her again. He's occupied for now. This is your chance to escape. There's an emergency exit down the hall. Since there's already an alarm going off, he may not notice it if you choose to go out that exit, the young man said. Wait, you're letting me go? She asked. Yes, please go and never come back, the young man said. What about you? She asked. Don't worry about me. Just leave and don't look back, the young man said. But you said that you were afraid of him, she said. Please go before he comes back. The young man said. Come with me, she said. I can't, the young man said. Why not? She asked. I have to stop him. If I leave now, nothing will ever change. I must find a way to put an end to this. The young man said. I'm sorry for not believing you, she said. Don't worry about that now. Just go. Your car is parked outside. Don't let him see you leaving, or he will follow you, and he won't stop until he captures you, the young man said. Thank you, she said. With that, she rushed out of the room and then she headed toward the exit that the young man told her about. She refused to look back as she continued to run toward the door. When she opened it, she ran out and rushed toward her car. When she approached it, she got into it, and then she started it and drove away. She did not look back as she left the horrible place behind.